What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning in to my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. And today is April 21st, 2025, 2:10 p.m. where I'm at right now. It's a holiday, and it's also a celebration because we are finishing our 10th book in our Book to React series, Racism in Europe by Neil MacMaster from 1870 to the year 2000. And let's just pat ourselves on the back real quick. Read this book cover to cover, word for word, line by line, on live for all the people to see, dropping mad knowledge, dropping a lot of history, a lot of game, a lot of facts that we didn't even know. Fascinating book, powerful book that covers, this is just a primer. This is just an introduction to the study of anti-blackness in Europe, the history of it, the precursors to the creation of anti-blackness, and also an examination of anti-Semitism as well on the continent. And I have to say, I've learned so much from this book. I've gained so much from this book. There were many things in here that I didn't know. Some things that challenged me, some things that gave me hope, like when I was reading the stories about the persecution of the Jewish people. That gives me hope as a black man. And also, many of the things that led up to the creation of anti-blackness. The Europeans were experimenting on themselves and others for centuries before they got to us. So that was some of the main takeaways I got from this book. And also, once again, this book is more evidence of a black presence in Europe before the mid to late 20th century. Don't ever let anybody tell you that we have not been on this continent, that we are not a part of the history of this continent, because we've been marching all over the planet for centuries, since humans have been around. So this is a very powerful book, and as we read the conclusion, we're going to be giving our final thoughts on this text. And before we start reading, I have to say, once again, if you're not able to join this live stream because it's too early where you are or too late where you are, join on the playback. Watch on 2x. Now YouTube has the 3x option, so it's even faster for you. And enjoy the show. And also pick up some game. And before we start the reading, we have to read the comments of the people who replied before. And the comment we have here are these lovely sets of hearts from my beautiful wife, Acti, who just sent hearts. And that's all we need. All we need is love and support, and for y'all to hit the like button and subscribe and comment so we can continue to push this content through the algorithm to break through all the people that just want to see big booty girls twerking and music videos. Man, we got to get some educational content out there for the people. So this is it. This is the last run till we hit the finish line. Conclusion, Black and Jew. And we're picking up here. Let's go. The two racisms. Throughout this study, we have tended to examine anti-black and anti-Semitic racism as if they constituted two quite discrete strands, which might suggest that individuals or groups located in one time and place would focus their prejudice almost uniquely on Jews with little concern for blacks, and in other instances primarily on blacks with little place for anti-Semitism. Historically, it can be argued that such a crude division makes some sense as shown in the European map of racisms. In the division between maritime colonial or ex-colonial states of the West and the landlocked nations of Central and Eastern Europe that contain the demographic core of the Jewish people. However, such a perspective overlooks the complex and crucial interrelationship between racisms at the individual level. The fact that each person will be socialized into a world with which may offer not one, but a whole range of potential outsiders or minorities as objects of dislike. Social psychologists have demonstrated that individuals, as well as the group to which they belong, tend to maintain a hierarchy of race, in which, for example, black Africans may be placed on the bottom rung, perceived in terms of the most negative characteristics, followed in sequence by other groups that are positioned even further up the ladder as they approach the most perfect human type represented by the white European subject or in-group. If the individual is usually prejudiced towards a range of others, what are the factors which generate greater hostility towards some groups rather than others? So this is a very powerful paragraph, and this goes back to something that I've said quite often. If you meet somebody who doesn't like Jewish people, most likely they don't have a very good opinion about black people, and also vice versa, and any other range of groups. It's very rare, and I would argue non-existent non-existent, that there is a group of people that dislike another group of people or perceive another group as outsiders that don't inherently have anti-blackness within them. If you're a person from X country and in X country they dislike Y group of people, definitely there's also a space for blackness to be viewed as negative as well. And I would also argue that anti-Semitism ebbs and flows in how much it is prevalent throughout our societies in different countries and cultures and stuff like that. But it does pop up, right? But I do believe anti-blackness is more central to a lot of people's negative worldviews of the others. Continuing here. If racisms are historically located, determined by specific contexts, then it is to be expected that they will alter through time and that the hierarchy of race, the ranking order, will also undergo change. It might, for example, be predicated that an interwar hierarchy in which hatred of Jews predominated over the relative lack of concern over blacks would be reversed post-1945 as large-scale colonial immigration took off, or that political conflict in the Middle East, the perceived rise of an Islamic threat, and a growing Muslim presence inside Europe would generate a more anti-Arab racism. Racial stereotypes do not, at the level of the individual psyche, exist as separate or discrete strands, but interrelate within a field. How and why individuals or groups focus their animus at a given moment against one minority rather than another, and how this can also be switched, provides an insight into the dynamics of racism. So basically what he's trying to say here is that in certain contexts, in certain times and spaces and places, it might change. If a country has a large proportion of Arabs moving there, or Muslims moving there, or Jewish people moving there, black people moving there, then of course it's going to change. Every nation, every space is going to have different dynamics of racism. But I would argue that at the core of a lot of that is anti-blackness as well. All right. An excellent opportunity to investigate the interrelationship between racisms is provided by the role of anti-black and anti-Semitic racism in contemporary extreme right-wing movements. As has been noted in Chapter 7, the last quarter of the 20th century saw the growth of far-right political parties in Western Europe that sought power through establishing a mass electoral base, a strategy that could only be effective if they dissociated themselves from the old Nazi or fascist traditions or acts of overt violence. Some parties, like the French Front National, have indeed achieved widespread legitimacy and electoral success through, for example, a shift to cultural racism. It may seem to be contradictory to such purposes and rather surprising that the FN, as well as other parties like the British National Front, should retain a core ideology of traditional anti-Semitism. Such respectable racist parties operate at two levels. At the open surface level, the entire message, directed at potential voters, sympathizers, and ordinary members, is aimed against blacks and immigrants. At a concealed level, aimed at an inner core of militants or party activists, the key message is based on anti-Semitism. Party leaders therefore consciously manipulate a field of prejudice in which a dynamic relationship exists between the two racisms. I think that's a good, way to view the right-wing parties generally. In a lot of countries where there is an active and oftentimes growing or surging right-wing wing of any political establishment or order, there is a party that fearmongers about the immigrants and especially tries to put a black face on the immigrants that are coming. This is why, Trump won the election by talking about the Haitians, which are a very, a group largely black, as if, I've only met one white Haitian in my life, but he fearmongered by calling them, dog eaters, cat eaters, and things like that. And people thought that was funny, and that traveled all across the world. And people basically ran with this joke, and it always starts as a joke, the anti-blackness, right? But, a lot of the fear-mongering Trump did about immigrants was couched in a lot of anti-blackness. And when we look at Marine Le Pen in France, she's couching a lot of her anti-immigrant sentiment by talking about the Africans that are flooding our borders and stuff like that as well. And so, yeah, that's on the surface level, and that gets a lot of people's attention, right? Or a lot of right-wing people's attention. But then when you're deeper off into the ideology of the right wing, they then start talking about the globalists and the financiers. And what do you know? They try to imply that a lot of those people that are movers and shakers in the world, the people that are the puppeteers, are actually Jewish, right? So let's continue here. Why the allegiance to anti-Semitism in a political context in which it might seem to be counterproductive, alienating rather than winning over voters? Part of the answer can be found in the fact that the generation of far-right leaders that pioneered the shift after 1970 towards national populism and an anti-immigrant politics, men like Le Pen, John Tyndall, Franz Schonhuber, and George Haider had received their political education and ideological formation after 1945 within the ranks of overtly Nazi and anti-Semitic movements. Anti-black racism presented a case of electoral opportunism that did not fundamentally displace the core anti-Semitic values. Secondly, such leaders have constructed a new racist discourse that enables coded anti-Semitic messages to be conveyed to the initiated, the party hardline militants, while remaining opaque to a wider public who might otherwise be alienating. For example, the British NF in the 1970s claimed not to be anti-Semitic, but anti-Zionist, while the FN, through the use of coded terms like cosmopolitanism, mondialist or globalist, rootless or nomadic people, usury, international finance, and so on, was able to construct anti-Semitic messages without once referring specifically to Jews. Such coding has served as a public signal from the leadership to militants and an inner coterie of old guard neo-Nazis, who frequently showed opposition to the electoral strategy and the apparent ditching of traditional ideology, that the core values did indeed remain intact. Coding and ambiguity sometimes appears to have gone wrong and to have backfired, as when Le Pen caused widespread scandal through his hinted support for the Holocaust denial. The genocide, he said, was a mere detail of the Second World War, or his punning reference to the Jewish minister Durafour in terms of Durafour cremator, for meaning oven in France. Okay, that's wild. That's wild. They basically threatened to kill. That's a threat. I would take that as a threat. If I was the Jewish leader of France and a right-wing leader of a party was saying that they want to put my Jewish ass in an oven by using a play on words, I'd have his ass shot. I'd hang him. I'd kill him. That for real. Like, what is the point of liberals having power if we're not going to wield it? What's the point of liberals having power if they're not going to wield it? You get what I'm saying? If a person is threatening your life and they have right-wing militants at their beck and call, Nazis that are willing to go into the street and do violence, and you're saying Durafour cremator as if like, you know, put me in the oven, you got to kill them. You got to kill them. Anyway, so hence for cremator for the Nazi gas ovens. But such gaffes may also have been quite deliberate, part of a wider revisionist strategy to reintroduce or normalize anti-Semitism, which would at the same time appease hardliners and to create a legitimate and acceptable image of Nazism and of Hitler through ridiculing the Holocaust or persuading persuading the public that it never took place. However, none of this explains why contemporary racists have remained so doggedly attached to anti-Semitism. Such durability and resilience derives from the powerful ideological structures and political benefits of the stereotype, in particular as a brand of conspiracy theory. The racial stereotype of the black, deriving both from colonial conquest and slavery, is of a race far inferior to the white European in innate intelligence, incapable of invention or rising to civilized standards, without assistance, lazy, dirty, driven more by animal instincts, violence, and uncontrollable sexuality than by reason, and prone to revert to primitive state characterized by paganism, the jungle, the mud hut, and cannibalism. One more thing I have to say, like, we already know all the stereotypes about the racists that the right wing say. I don't think we have to repeat them anymore. We shouldn't be. I know this book was written over like 24 years ago, so I'm going to chalk it up to that. But I just think going forward, us academics or us writers or us thinkers of black life and black expression in this white supremacist world don't need to repeat the lies that the white supremacists tell about us. We don't need to say we don't need to say jungles, mud huts, lazy, etc. We could just say XYZ. We don't need to repeat it, okay? Anyway, The problem with a post-war politics grounded on the threat of black immigration was how to explain the fact that such an inherently inferior race, an inferiority that it would be beyond any educational program or social improvement to alter, could offer any kind of challenge to white supremacy. The contradiction was resolved through anti-Semitism. The black, stupid, and inferior did not present a fundamental threat. This came far more from the Jew, who represented intelligence and a high level of organization. Frequently, racism has been defined as a system of belief that invariably assumes the genetic or cultural inferiority of the oppressed group. However, anti-Semitism is far more ambiguous in that it credits the Jews with superior qualities such as cleverness, strict moral standards, powerful group solidarity, energy, strong will, and high levels of achievement. Sounds like the Jews are the master race. By the own definition of the white supremacists, when they start to list all the things that have allowed the Jews to whoop their asses for centuries behind closed doors, despite the pogroms, despite the Holocaust, despite all other types of genocide and discrimination, the Jews seem like the master race, just by the white supremacist definition of what makes a race superior. Anyway, for Hitler, who recognized the Jew as the mightiest counterpart to the Aryan, with an infinitely tough will to live and preserve the species, the greater the diabolic cunning and power of the enemy, the deeper the level of anxiety and paranoia, and the sense of a desperate and final struggle for German survival. Since the gravest of all threats to the Aryans stemmed from racial mixing with lower types and from degeneration, it was the Jews who upheld their own racial purity and strength through strict racial endogamy, who procured this end through the deliberate introduction of blacks and interbreeding. The inferior blacks were thus an instrument of a malevolent Jewish conspiracy. At the same time, Jews were portrayed by the Nazis as effeminate and physically degenerate. A 1935 Nazi sports manual by Kurt Munch noted, "Among the inferior races, the Jews have done nothing in the athletic sphere. They are surpassed even by the lowest of the Negro tribes." In the same year, the racist propagandist Julius Streicher, incensed by the repeated victories of the black wrestler Jim Wango over white German contestants, interceded to halt a match in Nuremberg. The humiliation of defeat by a racial primitive was countered through the notion of Jewish subversion, a sequence of matches organized by the Jewish promoter Zerth. What we oppose is the linking of sport with dirty business interests and sales gimmicks. It is a sales gimmick, an appeal to inferior people, to subhumans, to put a Negro on view and let him compete with white people. It is not in the spirit of the inhabitants of Nuremberg to let white man be subdued by a black man. See, this is the thing about the white supremacists. They claim to be the master race. Literally, the Nazis said, we're the strongest, we're the smartest, we're the brightest, most beautiful, right? But when it came to wrestling or any other sport, and they start getting their asses whooped by other groups of people, particularly black men, then they say, we don't even want to play the sport anymore. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. We don't even want to see black men on stage. Even if they're better than us, smarter than us, brighter than us, more beautiful than us, we don't want to see it. So they'll just flip the whole table over. Sounds about right. All right, this type of thinking or formulation, the Jew as an evil manipulator of a race war, can be found quite consistently in contemporary anti-Semitism. In 1990, an FN leader, Georges Paul Wagner, denounced the perils of globalism and cosmopolitanism, i.e. the Jews, which favored lowering barriers to immigration so as to undermine and weaken the French people from within. The 1993 FN election program, 300 Steps for the Rebirth of France, denounced the globalist doctrine, which, usually dressed up as the rights of man, preaches the destruction of nations, the abolition of frontiers, mixing of races, cultures, and peoples. Similarly, the British NF journal, Spearhead, accused Jewish conspirators are promoting multiculturalism in order to achieve universal genocide by race mixing, a strategy for eventual world domination that would be achieved by retaining Jewish racial purity. It must be recognized that immigration into this country is not simply some economically determined accident, but consciously permitted as a calculated act of genocide against the British people. A favorite metaphor or image in European far-right propaganda, especially in cartoons, is that of Jews as puppeteers, concealed from the audience, pulling the strings of black dolls. In a typical FN cartoon, one black puppet in a line of similar faces complains, "But I don't want to vote," while behind him a hook-nosed man with thick lips says, "You'll do what I tell you to do." The British NF spearhead frequently claimed that Jews fomented race wars in the USA or Britain, destructive conflicts that undermine states. The real enemy, meanwhile, smilingly sits upstairs, pulls all the strings, and calls the tune to which both parties dance. Such a logic determined the racial hierarchy and the real political agenda concealed from the wider electorate. If Britain were to become Jew clean, she would have no N-word neighbors to worry about. Before 4chan went down, I saw a lot of memes. Saw a lot of things that disturbed me, saw a lot of things that made me laugh. One of my most memorable moments on 4chan was seeing the meme similar to what he described here. It was basically of a Jewish man, a large Jewish man on this like lithograph poster, pushed with two hands, pushing two people together. It was pushing a white woman and a black man together, and the white woman was like revulsed, and of course the black man looked very like savage and ugly and stuff like that. And so yeah, that was a part of one of the propaganda posters or propaganda memes that 4chan was disseminating at the time that showed their idea just clear as day. Basically, the idea that Jews are forcing white people to be along with black people so that they interbreed, weaken the white race while the Jews remain pure, right, to some degree. So I'll never forget that meme. That was kind of sick, and it showed me a lot about how they're, how they think, how their ideology is formulated. Continuing here. The idea of racial manipulation of naive blacks by cunning Jews is just one small part of a much wider structure of anti-Semitic ideology founded on a conspiracy theory in what Richard Hofstadter has called the paranoid style of politics. Anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, although it may appear bizarre and irrational to the uninitiated, provides a very powerful and seductive framework for understanding and interpreting the world. Typically, important events and the huge, complex forces that underlie them, the Cold War, capitalism, communism, economic crisis, international conflict, growing crime, moral decline, and so on, can be reduced to a simple cause. Supporters or members of extreme right-wing political movements who suffer from high levels of insecurity and anxiety are provided with a framework for understanding a chaotic and fast-changing world that seems at times overwhelming and out of control. At times of economic, social, and political crisis and disorientation, like that facing contemporary Russia, conspiracy theory and populist xenophobic nationalism offers a strong appeal to ordinary people. The demagogue and propagandist, from Le Pen to Zhirinovsky, offer simple solutions to complex issues. For ordinary Russians, the penetration of capitalism, of market relations, and foreign multinationals has been, in part, a real cause of growing mass unemployment, hyperinflation, and extreme poverty. Such insidious processes are readily presented in terms of American finance, and behind that, the evil machinations of rich and powerful cosmopolitans. A further attraction of conspiracy theory is that it provides a fail-safe mechanism to resolve any contradiction and to provide proof in the absence of evidence. For example, a lack of public or demonstrable evidence about Jewish conspiratorial activities can be ascribed to the diabolic cunning with which they operate. The very absence of an exposure of Jewish conspiratorial power by the press, cinema, and television is itself taken as proof of the extent to which Jews own or control the media and suppress the truth. Finally, the prevalence of a conspiracy theory helps explain why it is that powerful currents of anti-Semitism can exist even in regions or states where there is an almost total absence of Jews. A 1992 survey found that 10% of Poles thought there were 4 to 7 million Jews in the country. 25% put the number at 750,000 to 3.5 million, while the true number was 6,000, so few that most Poles would have no contact whatsoever with Jews. However, even if the numbers are shown to be objectively small, this is of no consequence to the anti-Semite, since for them, Jews wield such immense individual power as financiers, government ministers, or press barons that numbers are immaterial to the threat they pose. I'm pretty sure it would be the same thing if you ask, people in Budapest, Hungary, where I'm at right now, how many black people do you think are in Hungary? And they'll probably say, well, there's got to be about 500,000. I see them every time I walk outside. When in reality, a lot of the people are just passing through as tourists, like literally just here for a weekend or so. And on top of that, a lot of the people here, there's probably only like 10, maybe 1,000, maybe 5,000 Maybe there's only about 5,000 black people that live in the city of 2 million, people, right? And maybe even only a few more than that if you include the entire country of Hungary, right? But yet and still, you'll probably find that a lot of Hungarians who are right-wing and racist will probably say, yeah, there's too many black people here because we're just getting swamped and flooded, right? And I'm specifically pointing out black people because, like, of course there's going to be like more Asian people here, more Arab and Middle Eastern people here than black people, of course, in Central Europe. But we have to remember that a lot of anti-immigrant bias is based on anti-blackness. So that's why I'm pointing that out, right? Because if we gauge how they think about black people, we can gauge how they think about most other groups of people as well. Contemporary new right movements and respectable racist parties appear to break the links to an older tradition of fascism and to swing over to an anti-immigrant politics, but in reality, the rupture often takes place only at the surface. The failure to jettison anti-Semitism stems in part from the considerable explanatory power of the racial ideology. No attempt appears to have been made by the extreme right to modernize racial doctrine by developing a theory in which blacks, Asians, or any other group take on a similar function to the Jews. Apart from a recent tendency to portray oil-rich Arabs and Islamic fundamentalists in terms of powerful and global conspiratorial forces. When black immigration is presented as a danger, it is not in terms of threatening intelligent competitor, but rather of crude numbers, a primitive breeding power that will simply swamp and displace the white man in his own country. It might be objected that such ideological constructions of anti-black and anti-Semitic racism, while demonstrating how two modalities might interrelate or be placed in a hierarchy, remains quite untypical, confined to an inner core of activists. This is indeed the case, and the anomaly of extreme right parties is that through their overt anti-immigrant stance, they have had a much bigger impact on generating a popular anti-black racism than anti-Semitism. However, it can be argued that racial conspiracy theory has historic roots in contrasting anti-black and anti-Semitic traditions and stereotypes that can be found almost universally within European culture. Although there has been a relative lack of contemporary research into hierarchies of race at the individual level, there does exist an interesting body of investigation by American social psychologists carried out immediately after the Second World War, in particular by Adorno, Horkheimer, Bettelheim, and Allport. Bruno Bettelheim and Morris Janowitz, through in-depth interviews of 150 ex-servicemen from Chicago, set out to establish the relationship between anti-Semitic and anti-Negro prejudice. In general, this and similar investigations found that the two kinds of stereotype were made up of quite different, almost reciprocal sets of characteristics, presenting a more or less integrated pattern. Jews were perceived to have the following traits: controlling everything through the power of money, shrewd, mercenary, industrious, grasping, intelligent, ambitious, sly, and clannish, refusal to intermarry a closed-in group. Blacks were perceived quite differently as of low intelligence, ignorant, lazy and slackers at work, dirty, carriers of disease, sexually promiscuous, immoral, emotionally unstable, given to crimes of violence with razors and knives, fondness for gambling, inability to save, superstitious, flashy in dress. Okay. Whether we accept the basically psychoanalytic approach to this American school or not, the research demonstrated that anti-black and anti-Semitic stereotypes, each one of them consisting of an interlocking pattern of characteristics, were universally present within U.S. society at the individual level. In Bettelheim's sample, almost all the ex-servicemen were in varying degrees prejudiced towards both groups. Only 9 out of 150 were tolerant towards both Jews and blacks, and as the measure of the intensity of individual intolerance increased in scale towards Jews, so it also increased towards blacks. The more extreme the individual racist, the greater the hatred directed towards all minorities. Within any given historic context, any particular European society at a particular moment in time, one minority group may have been much more intensely disliked than another, to which a lesser degree of antipathy attached. What is of considerable interest to the history of racisms would be to track through a long period of time the process that might lead a dominant prejudice to weaken and be superseded or displaced by a minor. One way of viewing this is to regard each individual as entertaining a whole complex of racial stereotypes, usually placed in a hierarchy, and that these modalities constitute a latent resource, a kind of wardrobe or kit of racial types that can be called upon or activated within a specific historical context or conjure of events. During the period under review, 1870 to the year 2000, the image of the money-grasping, cunning, intelligent, and conspiratorial Jew, as opposed to the sexually libidinous, lazy, primitive, and unintelligent black, was diffused not only among an educated middle class, but among all Europeans. The origin of these powerful racial stereotypes was rooted in two distinct developments. One in the history of European expansion, the conquest of Africa, the slave system, and colonialism. The other in an even older millennial tradition of Christian persecution of a deicide minority. Until the end of the Second World War, anti-Semitism tended throughout Western and Eastern Europe to carry a greater psychic intensity or level of anxiety and fear, since the Jew was both an intelligence as well as lodged inside. All right? The black, apart from the crucial experience within the terrain of white colonial societies, was for most Europeans a far more exotic, distant, and external primitive that offered no real threat until he too migrated and in turn became an insider. This is not to say that the stereotypes were somehow the cause of racism, or that they remained fossilized or unchanging in form. Rather, the stereotypes may be seen as latent, diffuse, and generalized within European culture, a dangerous resource that could be called upon or mobilized according to the specific social and political moment. For the peasantry of interwar Central and Eastern Europe, the patterns of prejudice towards Jews were highly activated, but the same individuals would also have carried negative anti-black stereotypes that were diffused within popular culture through nursery rhymes, mission sermons, and Hollywood films. The rapidity with which an anti-black moral panic was generated in the 1920s in response to the presence of black French troops in the Rhineland is a testament to the latent power of stereotypes, even within a society in which the great majority had never seen a black person. During the period from 1870 to 2000, we have seen that the ideological formulations of the underlying patterns of prejudice can alter dramatically through time. From 1870 to circa 1945, the rise of biological racism was a reflection of an age in which scientific explanation of difference carried enormous prestige and legitimating authority. After 1945, the educated public came to see the roots of difference in terms of social and cultural formations, an anti-racist perspective to which the new racism reposted by making cultural barriers absolute. Groups were naturally and inexorably locked into separate compartments. Different age-old cultures and multiculturalism could only devastate. Mixophobia, whether of intermarriage and degeneration or of cultural bastardization and hybridization, showed an underlying continuity across the 20th century. In conclusion, what prognostications can be made about the likely trend in European racism as we move into the 21st century? This is a complex and controversial area of debate, but here attention is drawn to three areas: development within the European Union, the problem of institutional racism, and lastly, the impact of genetic science. So now we're about to get into some futurism here, and I'm very interested because I find, thinking about the future to be, an exercise that greatly influences the mind, influences logic and reasoning, and helps us prepare for those challenges that we are to face. So I'm looking forward to seeing what he has to say about, how racism will develop in Europe, what we can do to combat it, to fight it, hopefully to eliminate it, etc. So, Fortress Europe and racism. The disintegration of the old Soviet bloc has removed the firm controlling hand that suppressed and contained latent nationalism, while the descent into political anarchy, economic crisis, and cultural/ideological dislocation has produced conditions ripe for the proliferation of virulent forces of extremist nationalism both within and on the borders of Europe. This has been accompanied by the rise of anti-Semitism and of racialized ethnicity, in the sense that national hatreds are constructed in terms of minorities or opposing nations. Serbs towards Kosovans, I thought it was Kosovars, okay, that's interesting. Russians towards Chechens, and so on, that are viewed in terms of unbridgeable difference, whether of a quasi-biological or cultural racial kind. Countervailing such processes of disintegration is the fact that the EU constitutes a stable political bloc, dedicated officially to the protection of human rights and the outlawing of racism, and which acts as a moderating influence on those states like Poland, Hungary, and Turkey that wish to join the club. So this was made before, Poland and Hungary joined the EU. And as of this writing, Turkey is still not in the EU. And I highly doubt it ever will be. But prove me wrong. Tell me what y'all think. Anyway. However, wherever the boundaries of an enlarged EU may finally settle, such a Europe is still potentially exposed to racism from a number of directions. Firstly, the ever-powerful assertion of a fortress Europe, backed up by an integrated system of laws and computerized frontier policing, seems likely to deepen perceptions of us and them, of a higher civilized European order situated like an island within a threatening sea of starving, brutalized, but determined because desperate inferior peoples. Exclusion of such a threatening invasion is difficult to square with official multiculturalism that claims to extend political, cultural, and civic rights to minorities now permanently located within Europe. The simultaneous global expansion of migration flows, accompanied by cheaper and rapid air transport, means that the range of ethnic groups arriving in Europe as refugees has greatly expanded. The resultant heterogeneity, Sri Lankans, Kurds, Bangladeshis, Somalis, Chinese, and so on, has either transferred anti-black stereotyping onto the catch-all racialized categories of immigrant and refugee, also seen as lazy, parasitic, dirty, violent, criminal, diseased, or libidinous, or it has reinvigorated older stereotypes that had lain dormant, like anti-Gypsy prejudice or Islamophobia. So basically what he's trying to say here is like, yeah, as the EU, officially says it's for human rights, it's against racism, and it's about many progressive things that me as like a left-wing American, like the EU sort of symbolizes what we wish would be our government's official stances, right? But at the same time, as we see with the dissolution of the USSR and nationalist wars being fought, like we're seeing now with Russia and Ukraine, and the underlying tensions between Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Albania, in the Balkans as well, right? These wars, these battles are being fought on the lines of like cultural, social, racial differences that are inherent, that are concrete, and that cannot be changed, right? Like the Serbians truly believe that they are different than the Albanians. And, for foreigners that go to the Balkans, we see like y'all are basically the same. Y'all all eat chavapi, y'all all speak the same language, y'all all are very tall. You get what I'm saying? Like, it's so hard to wrap your mind around how people can racialize each other even when they're so different, right? And racialize them doesn't have to be based on skin tone. It could be cultural as well, right? And also at the same time as Europe has these intra-national conflicts within the borders of the EU, right? And also the battle ideologically about who is European and who is not. So the Georgians are European, but the Turks are not. You get what I'm saying? Like stuff like that. There's also a flood of immigrants from many parts of the non-European world who are coming there, and they are being caught with the catch-all of the stereotypes that were once foisted upon black people, right? So, continuing here. A United Nations report published in March 2000 estimated that the nationality rate in most EU states was now so low, on average 1.4 children per woman, that the Union would have to open its doors to some 159 million immigrant workers. By 2025, we're in 2025, I doubt there are 159 million non-EU citizens in Europe, right? Anyway, so they would need 159 million slaves. I mean, immigrants, workers by 2025 in order to keep the economy growing and going and have sufficient numbers in work to maintain the growing percentage of elderly pensioners. Some commentators have used such projections to argue that migrants, far from offering an economic burden, are vital to the European economy and that a liberal policy of controlled immigration should be encouraged. However, the danger implicit in the construction of a fortress Europe is that repressive border controls and policing could provide the precondition for the institution of a massive Gastarbeiter system in which migrants on short-term contracts could be exploited as a source of cheap labor, but denied basic legal, political, and citizenship rights. EU states, having learned from their mistakes in allowing an earlier phase of family reunification and permanent settlement, are likely to ensure that such a pattern is not repeated. Going to institutional racism. Moving on from EU policy, a second aspect, let me talk about this real quick. I'm sorry, I have to talk about this. Being here in Hungary, I've spoken to so many Hungarian people who, work in banks, they work in finance, they work in accounting and stuff like that. And they tell me, during our classes that, here in Hungary, they're basically doing this thing. Flying in Filipino, Chinese, Korean workers, basically people from Asia, from the third world, right, to come to Hungary on work visas, live in these large complexes near the factories that are in these small rural Hungarian towns that nobody goes to and nobody wants to live in because all the old people are there and they're only dying. And you get what I'm saying? So they have these huge complexes where they have these battery factories, these car factories where they're making stuff and basically exploiting cheap foreign labor. While at the same time, the front-facing part of Hungary is saying, like, we are against the invasion of Europe. We don't want to be mixed race, or in the Hungarian language, because they don't have a word for race. They call species, different species of people. So we Hungarians, in the words of Orbán Viktor, don't want to be a mixed species. Meanwhile, at the same time, the country is like allowing, thousands of immigrant workers to come here on, easily attainable temporary worker visas to work jobs and stuff like that. And to some degree, I'm a part of this economy. To some degree, where I work as an English teacher, right, I'm somewhat a part of the exploitable immigrant economy. Basically here on shaky ground, where at any moment my visa could be revoked. It's stuff like that, right? So yeah, this seems to be, he sort of kind of got this right. Neil MacMaster wrote this book in 2001, and in 2025, some of the things he's writing about are somewhat true. In many European countries, they are exploiting immigrant labor. Anyway, institutional racism. Moving on from EU policy, a second aspect of contemporary racism is that official eradication of prejudice is proving much more difficult than many had thought in the immediate post-war years. The issues here are extremely complex, but attention can be drawn to two elements. Common sense forms of racism, powerfully reinforced and reproduced by socialization and the mass media, are not readily dissolved through academic or educational programs that seek to demonstrate the irrationality of prejudice or the unscientific basis of racial categorization. Nor are governments always determined enough to implement legislation and policies that are effective in tackling institutional racism, itself crucially based on the everyday racism of police canteens, football terraces, and employment panels. Secondly, the decline of socialist and trade union movements and the general shift of all mainstream political parties and governments towards the right and towards the market, privatization, the deregulation of capital, cuts in state expenditure, and erosion of the welfare state has deepened the divide between rich and poor. Immigrants and ethnic minorities concentrated within the lower ranks of the working class have suffered disproportionately from such policies and become locked into zones of social exclusion, ghetto-like areas of poor housing, educational disadvantage, high crime, unemployment, and multiple deprivation. This in turn helps reinforce racial stereotypes that associate minorities with inherent inferiority, low intelligence, dirt, and criminality. The gap between official anti-racist discourse and police policy statements and the reality of governmental actions remains ever wide. So yeah, that relates to a critique of capitalism. We have to have a critique of capitalism whenever we're talking about racism as well, because to some degree, by the capitalists, who are mostly white men, seeking to deregulate the economies and seeking to continue to get rid of the social safety nets around the world in various different countries, want to keep the poor whites poor so they can continue to hate on the immigrants, the foreigner, the other, right? To some degree. And that's not conspiratorial, as we've seen. In many countries, whenever they get rid of these trade unions, whenever they stop people from being able to unionize, have collective bargaining and stuff like that, we see an uptick in rise of anti-immigrant action. We see an uptick in rise in racist and hate-filled attacks against people. So it's not conspiratorial to say that a group of very powerful elites, and I'm not talking about Jews, but a group of very powerful elites want to try to break up workers' collectives. They want to try to stop people from being able to confront capitalism and capitalist exploitation. They want to try to stop all that, to keep the working class divided and poor and fighting over low-paid jobs. All right, continuing here. Genetics and cloning, the revival of race science. Okay, here's where it's getting sci-fi. As we enter the new millennium, there are growing signs of a revival in scientific racism that is threatening to replay the pre-war eugenic debate, but this time backed up with the far more powerful tools of modern DNA analysis and genetic engineering. In 1969, the American educational psychologist Arthur Jensen published a long article in the Harvard Educational Review, How Can We Boost IQ and Scholastic Achievement?, in which he argued that educational programs have failed to improve achievement and that genetic factors, not just social and economic environments, explain differences between blacks and whites on test scores. Since then, this approach, the search for the so-called G factor, or a claimed general intelligence factor that differed by racial group, has been adopted by a number of psychologists, including Richard Lynn of the University of Ulster, Hans Eysenck, J. Philippe Rushton of the University of Western Ontario, Christopher Brand of Edinburgh University, and Richard Herrnstein and Charles Murray, joint authors of The Bell Curve, 1994. I swear to God, two things are true in life. Two things are true in life. Two things are true in life. Nas is the greatest rapper of all time, and the worst things tend to come from psychologists. The worst things tend to come from psychologists, and Illmatic and It Was Written are the two greatest albums of all time. I swear to God, how come there are so many psychologists that end up being so violently racist? Why? Somebody explain this to me. Somebody explain this to me, why so many of these psychologists write books about how black people are stupid, but they never write nothing about how white people are evil. Somebody write that book. How come the psychologists have never broken down the evils of the white man? Explain this to me. Anyway, continuing here. While the work of such experts has provided ammunition to extreme right-wing movements and also received undue attention in the media because of their controversial claims, in general, they have received little support from other scientists or sociologists who have had little difficulty in locating the statistical flaws and biases in the IQ approach. As a biologist, Stephen Rose has noted, this kind of work represents the last gasp of a pre-Copernican science, like the belief the sun goes round the earth. Nor have such race scientists received any wider legitimacy. The publishers, John Wiley, rejected books by both Jensen and Brand in 1996 and 1997. While Brand was sacked by Edinburgh University in August 1997, similarly, the libel action brought by the right-wing historian David Irving against Deborah Lipstadt's book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory, 1993, ended in the London High Court in April 2000 with a devastating judgment that showed how he had twisted historical evidence to support his anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi views. In general, the small band of academics promoting historical, sociological, or scientific racist theories, while attracting much media attention, precisely to the extent that their maverick ideas have clashed with current liberal values, have gained little scholarly or public respectability. However, much more scientifically valid and ethically complex issues have been raised by rapid advances in the field of human genetic engineering, including the cloning of Dolly the sheep by a team of Edinburgh scientists in February 1997, and the first stage completion in June 2000 of the race to decipher the genome, the 3 billion letter DNA alphabet that provides the blueprint for each individual. The rapid development of a range of new techniques, the ability of doctors to carry out artificial insemination, the processes of egg and sperm donation, the screening of fetuses and preventive abortion for a range of inherited diseases, the growing ability to isolate genes that cause cystic fibrosis, Huntington's chorea, diabetes, hemophilia, cancers, and possibly obesity, and processes of engineering that can purify genes of life-crippling flaws. Such techniques undoubtedly have a huge future potential for the relief of suffering and the enhancement of life. At the same time, such advances mean that biological science is rapidly achieving the technical means to realize the objectives that pre-war eugenics and Nazi scientists mistakenly thought they had cracked. The science of being able to control the births of some kinds of people rather than others. The idea of engineering or cloning a standardized human being has long been a theme in 20th century science fiction. Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, 1932, provided an alarming picture of technology producing artificial assembly line babies. In Ira Levin's The Boys from Brazil, 1976, the Nazi scientist Dr. Mengele, after escaping to Brazil at the end of the war, secretly found the means to clone 94 children from tissue taken from Adolf Hitler's body. While such fiction, that's a stupid book. That's a really fucking stupid book. While such fiction appears to be entirely mythical or fanciful, the most recent discoveries in genetics are close to making such technologies entirely feasible, even if the political context for the realization of such eugenic dystopias are not. In January 1998, members of the European Parliament felt sufficiently concerned by the Dolly experiment to pass a resolution against cloning of human beings, since it represented a serious violation of fundamental human rights and is contrary to the principle of equality of human beings as it permits a eugenic and racist selection of the human race. Many scientists have opposed such precipitate controls as ill-informed and also damaging to the enormous potential of genetic engineering for the prevention of major diseases. Much of the debate on the ethical issues that arise from genetics relates to matters that are not specifically to do with race, for example. If genetic screening can, from an early age, detect the probability of an individual contracting in later life a particular degenerative disease or cancer, then insurance companies will undoubtedly refuse to provide medical or life insurance policies. Here, I am concerned solely with the issues that relate to race. Jonathan Glover, director of the Center for Medical Law and Ethics at King's College London, has argued that genetics engineering is consistent with human rights as long as decisions about the kinds of children to be born are not taken by the state, the Nazi or eugenic scenario, but may be taken with certain safeguards by parents. However, even within the realm of parental choice, the rapidly growing technical means to opt for designer babies does carry with it a racial potential. American women already offer to sell their eggs commercially for IVF through advertising on the internet. And in doing so, not only list their age and religion, but also their physical features, color of hair, complexion, eye color, state of health, teeth, excellent, and race, Caucasian, Japanese. In Italy, a black woman gave birth to a white baby after being implanted with an egg from a white donor. It's gotta be Tanzanian, gotta be Ghanaian, gotta be Nigerian. No. Of course. In Italy, a black woman gave birth to a white baby after being implanted with an egg from a white donor, fertilized in vitro by her white husband. That's insane. Dog, where's that movie? That's insane. How much self-hate do you have to have? Now, having a white husband is not self-hate. But what would be the desire? Unless she was infertile. I'm going to stop. I'm not going to judge her. I'm not going to judge her and say that she has self-hate unless she's infertile. Because I don't understand this. I don't understand the logic or the reason for doing this. Because if that's the case, you could have just adopted. You could have just gotten a white baby. Like go to the orphanage and pick up, the blondest blue-eyed baby. Or it's an Italian baby, so that baby's kind of swarthy. But you get what I'm saying? Why would you do this? Anyway, In Italy, a black woman gave birth to a white baby after being implanted with an egg from a white donor, fertilized in vitro by her white husband. The woman. That sounds like something that would just piss Dr. Umar off. I'm sorry, that's hilarious. The woman felt that a white child would have better chances in life and not suffer from racial discrimination. Oh, I knew that. I know that's bad. That's bad. Oh, that's bad. That's bad. They're still going to suffer from racial discrimination because they're Italian, of course. I mean, you know, they're the N-words of Italy, right? Like that's what all the Italians say. Hey, we're like N-words too, right? So yeah, they're still going to suffer. You picked the wrong white people to populate with. Anyway, there is a potential danger that such individual or parental choices, even if not coerced by the state, could, if multiplied many thousands of times and over a long time scale, lead to a racial drift, the dominance of some phenotypes and the elimination of others. However, such an elimination of biological diversity would not be primarily caused by genetic engineering, since this provides only the means, but rather by the depths of racist values within society. I guess it's more, indicative of the society rather than it is of individuals, right? Because individuals only want what's best for their children. And if you grow up in Italy, France, whatever country, Turkey, Russia, Yugoslavia, whatever, any country, right? Being black is going to be a disadvantage. Parents want their children to have the best advantages for them, right? Unfortunately, there are some children that are born black because their parents are selfish. They just want that niache. I'm sorry. No, I don't think that. But I'm just saying, parents want the best for their kids. So if parents make the choice to give their kids blonde hair, blue eyes, they're trying to make, the calculation that that their kids will have better opportunities, right? It's in the minds of some parents. And I'm not saying that's right either. So don't clip me. Anyway, a far more worrying potential for the abusive and racial deployment of genetics lies in the realm of the state. Those scientists and politicians who favor the largely unfettered advance of genetic engineering argue the impossibility of a Hitler scenario and the breeding of a super race on a number of grounds. Firstly, responsible democratic governments can ensure that proper national and international safeguards, laws, and treaties can be put in place to prevent the globalization of dangerous science, just as was achieved with nuclear weapons. Secondly, the medical community, which dedicates itself to the relief of human suffering, can be trusted to police itself and to follow an ethical code. In reply, it can be noted that at the global level, the existence of political regimes that have in recent decades engaged in ethnic cleansing and genocide should give strong grounds of concern about a future state eugenics. In March 1999, prior to the murder trial of Dr. Wouter Basson, former head of South Africa's chemical and biological warfare program, it was revealed that he had once plotted a mass sterilization of blacks and sought to develop a drug to reduce fertility. While within the present context of European politics, such a nightmare scenario seems impossible, there does remain a worrying potential for the future growth of authoritarian and highly xenophobic regimes that might reinforce a cultural racism of closed boundaries and Volkish purity. Far more of a threat within Europe could come from a eugenic drift within liberal democracies. There has, in the past, been a tendency to equate the worst excesses of eugenic practice with Nazi Germany. However, historians have in recent years shown not only that normal doctors played a key role in the elaboration of Nazi genocide, but that wide-scale programs of enforced sterilization took place in the United States from as early as 1907 and spread during the 1930s into European states with the most impeccable liberal or progressive credentials, including Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and France. It came only to light in the 1990s that the Swedish sterilization of 60,000 women to remove inferior racial and degenerate types started in 1935, continued to the end of 1976. Similar practices survived in the USA until the early 1970s, while in September 1997, the French government launched an urgent inquiry after a report revealed that 15,000 women in psychiatric institutions had been sterilized without permission. The slippery slope to the eugenic abuse of human rights began as we saw in Chapter 1, from the reasonable utilitarian and cost-benefit forms of welfare analysis that estimated the enormous cost to society and to the economy of feeding and caring for mentally and physically handicapped defectives. Lastly, even if legal and political controls are sufficiently rigorous to ensure that genetic engineering does not lead to a racial eugenics, the advances in biology may still serve to reinforce popular racism. The work of sociobiologists has reinforced the notion that nature is more determinate than nurture, while journalists and other popularizers of the new genetics have promoted bogus ideas about the detection of genes for criminality, homosexuality, violence, and other deviances, as did the old eugenics. However, the potential for genetic decoding to change social engineering and the arguments for biological determinism should not be exaggerated. What is unique to Homo sapiens is the ability to transform the world within which the species is located, to construct cities, to invent steam engines, cars, computers, and aircraft. Each infant is born into an already existing universe of social customs, language, and technologies. And although each individual necessarily brings with them a particular genetic framework, how their potentialities and knowledge develops depends most crucially on the vast body of culture, learned knowledge, and behavior that is transmitted across generations. The growing media attention to the Genome Project and genetics, frequently dished out in a spurious and sensational form, runs the risk of obscuring from sight that how we engage in a progressive politics, an educational reform, and the wider goals of attaining a society based on equality is more crucial than any hereditary components. A biological essentialism that rests on a claim to the truth of the gene and its all-powerful and determinate function reinforces the hand of extreme right-wing movements keen to revive a race science, as well as conservative governments eager to place the irrevocably criminal in detention and to cut back on redistributive taxation, universally available health care, and equal opportunity in education. Governments and educators have a major responsibility to ensure that no window of opportunity be provided for the reconstruction or resurgence of a dynamic, if mythical, race science. Applaud to Neil MacMaster. Shout out to Neil MacMaster, man. This book was the absolute truth, and he closed it up so well. Love this book so much, man. I gotta buy this book one day. Put it on my shelf when I settle down and live in the south of France. One day, with me and all my Negroes. Me and all my Negroes, man. We got a library, we got a coffee shop, and we just sitting back kicking it because white supremacy has been killed and destroyed, and we finally defeated the devil, and the world is now free for everybody to be who they want to be. Powerful, powerful book. Excellent book. Love this book so much. So glad we got through it. It's been a long road. We finished it. We finally completed it. Shout out to everybody that tuned in. I know nobody came in today because it's probably very early where you are. The reason I'm doing my live stream at this time today is because it's a holiday here in Hungary. So I'm up doing the live stream early because I got some other things I want to do, some writing, some reading, some playing my guitar, some walking outside in this beautiful sun. About to go eat lunch right now, you feel me? So it's been a very, very, very powerful read. This is one of my favorite books. I can say wholeheartedly this is one of my favorite books of all time. It's so crazy to think this book was written over 24 years ago and it's still so potent and powerful and on point. You gotta pick up this book. You gotta pick up this book. If you don't pick it up, watch the live stream where I read every single page, every single paragraph, every single line, and support this content. For real, for real. This is a very dope book. Love it so much. So let me give a shout out to everybody that I met along the way on this journey. Shout out Dorvel, shout out Kamal, shout out Ozzy, shout out Acti, shout out Nelson Moreno, shout out everybody who's shown me love as we finished this powerful book. Once again, round of applause, round of applause. We did it. So this will be the last live stream for this book. Thank you, everybody who tuned in. And let me know what other books you want me to read. We have a book request from Door of L coming up. I forgot the exact name. He sent me a bunch of books to my email, and I like that. I like that he sent me a bunch of other books. Here's some other books on race and racism that he suggested. I might look into this later, maybe pick out one of those to continue the study.